My mother-in-law and sister-in-law spread lies about me, and my husband threw me out without even hearing my side of the story. I was treated horribly by my husband and his family for months and finally made my way away from that toxic environment. However, they thought they could come back and traumatize me again. But this time, I stood up for myself and my baby daughter. I met my ex, Mark 37M, when we were both living in France and in our 20s. I'm half Canadian and half French, and Mark is American. At the time, he was working on his PhD, and I was living with family while interning as a photographer for a local newspaper. We met through a mutual friend at his university. From the moment I saw him, I was blown away by how charming and smart he was. After months of hanging out together in groups, I finally gathered the courage to ask him out, and he said yes. One date led to another, and soon we were in a relationship. Thinking back to those days feels so strange now, as if it was another life entirely. That's how different things are now, and how much Mark has changed. Back then, Mark was the brilliant, funny guy I fell in love with. But over time, he turned out to be a seemingly heartless and completely selfish man. Our relationship started out wonderfully. We dated for almost a year before moving in together. After that, we lived together for 2 years. By the end of that time, Mark had finished his PhD, and it was time for him to move back to the States. We knew this day was coming, of course, and we had discussed the possibility of me moving to the States with him. For context, I'm originally from Canada, and I had planned to leave France earlier, but after Mark and I got serious, I decided to extend my stay until his PhD was completed. If only I could go back and tell myself to stick to my original plans. Anyway, long story short, Mark proposed, and I made the decision to leave behind my family and career in France, as well as my family in Canada, and move to the United States with him. I was young and in love, and I convinced myself that Mark would do the same for me if the roles were reversed. I was optimistic about our future together, but things began to unravel quickly after we moved to the States. When we first moved, Mark and I didn't have a place to live. It was my first time in the US, so to make things easier until we found our own home, we decided to stay with Mark's family. This turned out to be the worst decision we could have made, but I didn't realize it at the time. Mark's family included his mom, his sister Julia, her young daughter, and his older brother. His brother lived halfway across the country with his wife, and I met him only once. Both he and his wife were incredibly kind to me. I wish I could say the same about my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. Unfortunately, luck was not on my side. During the first few months of our stay in the US, Mark and I lived at his mom's house, where Julia was also living. She had recently divorced her husband and needed help with her young daughter. I knew about this arrangement before moving in and didn't mind at all. I grew up in a big family, so I thought, the more, the merrier. Another mistake. Mark's mother and sister were a bit cold to me right from the start. It wasn't that they were outright mean to me, but their behavior always seemed a bit fake and passive-aggressive. At first, I often felt like I was imagining it because they were always polite to me to my face. After a few weeks, when I started to feel certain that they didn't like me, I told myself that maybe they just needed more time to warm up to me. But that never happened. Eventually, I decided to talk to Mark about how I was feeling. His reaction left me even more confused. He told me that it was all in my head, that his mom and sister loved me, and that I was probably misinterpreting things because of cultural differences. Mark said that since I'd spent my entire life in Canada and France, I just didn't understand how Americans were. I wasn't very convinced, but I decided to give them the benefit of the doubt and tried even harder to build a connection with my sister-in-law and mother-in-law. It was a futile effort. Thankfully, after about 3 months of living there, Mark and I finally found our own place to live. However, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law weren't happy about this at all. They tried to convince us to stay longer, even suggesting that we live with them until we got married. I was completely against that idea and convinced Mark to move out as planned. I believe this was another reason why my sister-in-law and mother-in-law hated me. I can't think of any other explanation for their animosity. By that point, I'd given up on the idea of us having anything more than a civil relationship. Once Mark and I moved into our own small but cozy apartment, things seemed to improve, at least for a little while. Mark found a teaching job and I started looking for work. We still saw Mark's mom and sister frequently, as they lived nearby and often invited us over for dinner. I didn't mind putting up with them for a few hours, as long as I didn't have to live with them. Then, just as things seemed to settle down, I found out I was pregnant. The pregnancy wasn't planned, and Mark and I had even postponed our wedding because we wanted to be more financially stable first. But despite the surprise, I was overjoyed. Mark also seemed excited and said maybe this was a sign of good things to come. We decided to have a small ceremony at the courthouse and save a bigger celebration for later. I was hopeful that having a baby might help bridge the gap between me and Mark's family, but unfortunately, it had the opposite effect. The first major fight with Mark's family happened when we decided to share the news of my pregnancy. We planned a surprise for his mom and sister, bringing over the baby's first ultrasound in a cute frame. They weren't home when we arrived, so we waited for them in the living room. Then, as fate would have it, we overheard them talking about me as they walked into the house. My sister-in-law was mocking me in a terrible French accent, and both of them were saying horrible things about me. They claimed I acted superior to everyone because I was from Europe. My mother-in-law even made nasty comments about me that I won't repeat here. I was in tears, and Mark turned bright red with anger. He stormed out to confront them, and a nasty argument ensued. We ended up leaving their house, furious and heartbroken. For the next couple of months, we had no contact with Mark's family. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. When I was about 5 months pregnant, Mark's mom called him, apologized, and asked him to visit her. I didn't want him to go, but he insisted. I don't know what they talked about, but when Mark came home, he was acting strange. He became distant and irritable, and no matter how much I tried, he wouldn't open up to me. I gave him space, hoping he would snap out of it. But he didn't. After a week of his cold behavior, I confronted him, demanding to know what was going on. At first, he denied anything was wrong, but when I kept pushing, he finally snapped. They told me everything, he said. I was completely confused and asked him to explain. That's when he said his mom and sister told him that they'd overheard me on a call with my mom, complaining about living in the US, hating his family, and even calling them dirty rednecks. I was absolutely horrified. I had never said anything like that in my life. I admitted to Mark that I'd spoken to my mom about how hard it was adjusting to life in the US, but I never insulted anyone. I begged him to believe me, but he refused. They wouldn't lie to me, he insisted. You need to apologize to them. We had a huge argument, and Mark stormed out of the apartment. I stayed up all night waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. When I finally fell asleep and woke up the next day, I found a text from Mark. It read, "I'll come back when you're ready to apologize." That was the last straw for me. I was hurt, pregnant, and alone, but I knew I needed to take control of the situation. I texted him back, lying and saying I was ready to apologize, just to get him to come back. Within an hour, Mark showed up, bringing his mom and sister with him, both of them looking smug. The moment they sat down in our living room, I lost it. I unleashed all the frustration, pain, and anger I had bottled up. I ranted about everything they had put me through since the moment I arrived in the States. I told them how I had tried to win them over, only to be met with passive-aggressive behavior and outright lies. Mark's mom and sister fought back, calling me a liar and accusing me of trying to take Mark away from his family. My sister-in-law called me a nasty foreigner and said I was just using Mark to get a better life. I turned to Mark, hoping he would defend me, but he just looked away and said, "Maybe it's best if you leave for a bit." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man I had uprooted my entire life for, the father of my unborn child, was throwing me out of our home to appease his toxic family. But instead of breaking down, something in me snapped. My pride finally kicked in. I told Mark, "Fine, I'll leave, but don't think for a second that I'm coming back." I packed a few of my belongings and left the apartment. I checked into a hotel that night and called my parents in Canada, telling them everything. They immediately offered to fly me home. Within a week, I was back in Canada, surrounded by my supportive family. I filed for divorce as soon as possible and began rebuilding my life without Mark. Months passed, and I gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl. She was my everything, my light in the darkness. I was determined to give her the best life possible and shield her from the toxicity of Mark and his family. But just a few weeks after my daughter was born, I received a letter from Mark. It wasn't a letter of apology or congratulations. Instead, it was a demand for custody. Mark wanted me to return to the States with my daughter so she could live with him and his mother. I was livid. After everything they had put me through, they thought they had the right to demand my child? I wasn't going to let that happen. Mark's letter infuriated me to no end. How dare he and his family think they could waltz back into my life and claim my daughter after everything they had done? I wasn't about to let my child grow up in the same toxic environment that had nearly destroyed me. At first, I debated whether to respond at all. My parents and friends urged me to let the lawyers handle everything, but the longer I stared at that ridiculous letter, the angrier I got. I couldn't stay silent, so I booked a flight back to the States. When I arrived at Mark's mother's house, I was ready for war. I had my daughter's birth certificate, legal paperwork, and the rage of a mother determined to protect her child. Mark, his mother, and his sister were all sitting in the living room when I walked in. Their arrogance was palpable. They truly thought they had the upper hand. I wasted no time. I reached into my bag, pulled out the letter, and tore it to shreds right in front of them. The look of shock on their faces was priceless. "How dare you think you can demand custody of my daughter after the way you treated me?" I said, my voice trembling with anger. Mark stammered, trying to defend himself. "We're her family too, and you're being unfair. My mom and sister just want what's best for her." I scoffed. "What's best for her? You mean the same way you all treated me while I was pregnant and vulnerable? You kicked me out, abandoned me, and didn't even bother to show up when your daughter was born. You don't get to decide what's best for her. You're not a father. You're just a coward. His mother jumped in, calling me a liar and claiming that I was vindictive and trying to alienate Mark from his daughter. I laughed in her face. Vindictive? You mean like the way you and your daughter spread lies about me and turned my husband against me? That kind of vindictive? Mark's sister tried to shout over me, saying, marrying you was the worst decision Mark ever made. You're just an evil, manipulative woman who's trying to steal his child. I turned to her and smiled. You know what's funny? I don't have to manipulate anyone. Mark lost his daughter the moment he chose to believe your lies over his wife. Then I delivered the final blow. If any of you think you'll get custody of my daughter, I'll see you in court. And don't think I won't expose how you treated a pregnant woman to your entire community. Let's see how much sympathy you get when everyone knows the truth. The room went silent. Mark and his family looked stunned, as if they hadn't expected me to fight back. True to my word, I hired a team of lawyers and filed for full custody of my daughter. Mark fought back, encouraged by his mother, but his case was weak. I had evidence, text messages, recorded conversations, and witness testimonies from friends who had seen how his family treated me. On the other hand, all Mark's family had were lies and baseless accusations. The process was long, emotionally draining, and expensive, but I was determined to protect my child. In the end, the court ruled in my favor. Mark's parental rights were terminated, and I was granted full custody of my daughter. It's been over a year since the custody battle ended, and life is finally stable again. My daughter is growing up surrounded by love from my family, and I've started rebuilding my career in photography. As for Mark and his family, I haven't heard from them since the court's decision. I blocked all their numbers and social media accounts, and my lawyers made it clear that any further attempts to contact me would be considered harassment. I've also started seeing someone new, though we're taking things slow. He's kind, supportive, and respects my boundaries. Everything Mark wasn't. Most importantly, I've learned to stand up for myself and my daughter. I'll never let anyone try to control or belittle me again. My message to anyone in a similar situation: you are stronger than you think. Never let anyone take away your voice or your power. Thank you for reading my story and for all the love and support. My daughter and I are finally free, and we're never looking back. The end.